The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Buckingham Palace as James Thompson adjusted his bearskin cap for the 100th time that day. At 6 feet 2 inches tall, he cut an impressive figure in his pristine ceremonial uniform, every button polished to a mirror shine. The weight of tradition rested on his shoulders along with his heavy wool uniform. Being part of the Queen's Guard wasn't just a job, it was an honor earned through years of dedicated military service. As tourists began filling the plaza in front of the palace, James maintained his legendary stillness, a skill perfected over his 5 years of guard duty. The summer heat was already building and beads of sweat formed under his thick uniform, but his face remained as composed as a statue. Children pointed and waved, trying to catch his eye or make him smile, while their parents snapped photos with expensive cameras and smartphones. An American family approached, their young daughter clutching an illustrated guide to the palace. "Look, Daddy, he's not moving at all," she exclaimed, her eyes wide with wonder. Her father lifted her onto his shoulders for a better view, and James felt a hint of a smile trying to break through his stern expression. These were the moments that made the long hours of standing guard worthwhile. The morning crowd had its usual mix of visitors. Retired couples consulting their guidebooks, school groups in matching uniforms, and young backpackers trying to capture the perfect selfie. A street performer dressed as Charlie Chaplin entertained people in the distance, his act adding to the cheerful atmosphere that typically surrounded the palace grounds. James scanned the growing crowd, as he'd been trained to do, noting everything while appearing to notice nothing. His mind wandered briefly to the journey that had brought him here, from his childhood dreams of serving in the military to the rigorous selection process for the Queen's Guard. His father, a former Royal Air Force pilot, had beamed with pride at his graduation ceremony. A group of Japanese tourists bowed respectfully before taking photos, their tour guide explaining the history of the Queen's Guard in hushed tones. The scent of fresh coffee wafted over from a nearby cart, mixing with the crisp morning air and the faint perfume of the palace gardens. These small details had become part of James's daily routine, each one as familiar as the weight of his rifle or the rhythm of the changing of the guard. Behind his stoic expression, James was already planning the rest of his day. After his shift, he promised to meet his younger brother for lunch at their favorite pub near Tower Bridge. They hadn't seen each other in weeks due to their busy schedules, and he was looking forward to catching up. His brother had always been fascinated by James's stories about life in the Queen's Guard, especially the unexpected moments that tourists never got to see. The morning continued its peaceful pace, with tourists coming and going in waves. A young couple asked another visitor to take their photo, and James could hear them debating whether to try making him laugh. He'd heard every joke and seen every trick over the years. It had become something of a personal challenge to maintain his composure through it all. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, more visitors began to gather. The changing of the guard would happen soon, and the crowd was building up in anticipation of the ceremony. Street vendors appeared at the edges of the plaza, selling water bottles and small Union Jack flags to eager tourists. The atmosphere was festive and lighthearted, just as it should be on a beautiful summer morning in London. Little did James know that this ordinary day was about to take an extraordinary turn. The peace of the morning would soon be shattered by an incident that would test his training, his professionalism, and his character in ways he never expected. But for now, he stood tall and proud, embodying centuries of tradition and discipline as the warm summer breeze carried the distant chimes of Big Ben across the palace grounds. The peaceful morning atmosphere began to shift as a loud voice cut through the gentle murmur of the crowd. Robert Klein, a tourist who had clearly started his day with several drinks, was making his presence known in all the wrong ways. He stumbled through the plaza, his expensive camera swinging from his neck, muttering comments that made nearby parents hurriedly usher their children away. At first, people tried to ignore him, turning their backs and focusing on their photos of the palace. But Klein's voice grew louder, and his comments became more targeted, especially when he noticed James standing at his post. A young couple from Canada exchanged worried glances as they stepped away from the growing disturbance. The woman pulled out her phone, her finger hovering over the emergency number, just in case. The street performer in his Charlie Chaplin costume stopped his act, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced with concern as he watched the situation unfold. Tourists who had been happily snapping photos moments before began to drift away from Klein's vicinity, creating a visible gap around him in the usually packed plaza. A group of university students who had been sketching the palace architecture for their art class packed up their supplies and moved to a different spot, throwing disapproving looks in Klein's direction. One of them approached a nearby police officer, speaking in hushed but urgent tones while gesturing toward the increasingly disruptive tourist. Klein's behavior was becoming more erratic with each passing minute. He pulled out a half-empty water bottle that clearly didn't contain water, taking long swigs between his offensive comments. His face was red from the combination of alcohol and the summer heat, his designer shirt already showing sweat stains despite the early hour. Two elderly ladies who had been admiring the palace gardens quickly shuffled away, clutching their handbags close. "We should have let someone," one whispered to the other, but the police were already aware, maintaining a careful watch on the situation while radioing for backup. The officers knew from experience that situations like this could escalate quickly. Phones started emerging from pockets and bags, not to capture the majesty of Buckingham Palace, but to document Klein's increasingly concerning behavior. A father lifted his young son onto his shoulders and stepped back, making sure they were well away from any potential trouble while still keeping an eye on the unfolding scene. The tour guide who had been explaining the history of the Queen's Guard now switched to quietly directing his group to a safer viewing spot, his practiced smile replaced with a look of professional concern. He'd seen troublemakers before, but something about Klein's demeanor suggested this situation was different. The coffee cart vendor, who had served hundreds of tourists that morning, slowly began packing away his more fragile items, his years of street experience telling him to prepare for any possibility. He caught the eye of a nearby souvenir seller, and they shared a knowing look. They'd seen tourists misbehave before, but this felt more dangerous. Through it all, James maintained his professional composure, though his military training had kicked his senses into high alert. He could see the police officers slowly moving into position, ready to intervene if necessary. His peripheral vision tracked Klein's movements, while his posture remained perfectly still, exactly as his training had prepared him for. The morning had transformed from a typical tourist scene into a tense situation that everyone could feel building. The usual sounds of tourist chatter and camera clicks were replaced with uncertain murmurs and concerned whispers. Even the pigeons seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, taking flight from their usual spots near the palace gates. None of the onlookers knew exactly what would happen next, but there was a collective sense that they were about to witness something unprecedented at the usually peaceful palace grounds. The stage was set for a confrontation that would soon make headlines around the world and challenge everyone's expectations of what a royal guard could and would do when pushed too far. The tension in the air reached its breaking point as Klein stumbled past the rope barrier, crossing a line both literal and figurative. The crowd collectively held its breath, phones raised high to capture what everyone knew would be a significant moment. A child's voice broke through the sudden silence. "Mummy, why is that man being so mean?" James's voice rang out, clear and commanding. "Step back from the Queen's Guard." The words echoed across the plaza, carrying the weight of centuries of tradition and authority. It was the standard warning, one that usually stopped tourists in their tracks. But Klein was beyond heeding warnings. "What are you going to do about it?" Klein slurred, taking another unsteady step forward. His expensive watch glinted in the sunlight as he gestured wildly, his face twisted with misplaced anger. The nearby police officers began moving in, but they were still several crucial steps away. Two teenage girls who had been taking selfies quickly backed away, their phones now documenting the unfolding scene. A street vendor who had seen countless tourist interactions with the guards over his years of selling souvenirs knew this was different. He'd never seen anyone cross the barrier with such obvious ill intent. An older gentleman in the crowd, himself a former military man, recognized the disciplined tension in James's stance. Despite his perfectly maintained ceremonial position, James had shifted his weight ever so slightly, ready to react if necessary. It was a subtle change that only someone with military training would notice. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the scene as Klein invaded James's space, bringing with him the sour smell of stale alcohol. A young mother pulled her children behind her, shielding them from what was about to unfold. The tour guide who had been explaining the history of the Queen's Guard now stood silent, his usual script forgotten in the face of this unprecedented situation. I said, "Step back," James repeated, his voice carrying the same steady authority despite the escalating situation. A group of pigeons took flight, startled by the tension in the air, their wings creating a momentary distraction as they scattered across the blue summer sky. Klein's response was to lash out, his hand reaching for James's uniform in a clumsy but aggressive movement. The crowd gasped, someone shouted no, and several people stepped forward instinctively before catching themselves. The police were running now, but they wouldn't make it in time. Time seemed to slow down as Klein's hand made contact with the pristine red uniform. A professional photographer who had been capturing tourist photos all morning pressed his shutter button rapidly, knowing he was documenting a moment that would soon be seen around the world. The coffee cart vendor who had served hundreds of tourists that morning wrapped his hands around his paper cup, crushing it slightly as he watched the scene unfold. He'd seen tourists try to make the guards laugh, seen them pose for silly photos, but never this, never such a blatant display of disrespect and aggression. A retired teacher in the crowd found herself gripping her guidebook tightly, her knuckles white with tension. She'd just been explaining to her grandchildren about the proud tradition of the Queen's Guard, about how they were real soldiers beneath their ceremonial uniforms. Now those children were about to see just how real these guards were. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension as Klein's aggressive moves set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everyone's perceptions of the Queen's Guard. James stood at the crossroads of tradition and necessity, duty and self-defense, with the whole world watching through the lenses of dozens of phones and cameras. What happened next would become one of the most viewed videos of the year, a moment that would spark discussions about respect, dignity, and the limits of patience in the face of unbridled hatred. What happened next was so swift and precise that many tourists would later have to watch their videos in slow motion to fully understand it. James's years of military training took over in an instant, his movements flowing with the practiced ease of someone who had drilled for this exact scenario countless times. Like a dance move choreographed to perfection, James stepped slightly to his left, using Klein's own momentum against him. His right hand maintained its grip on his ceremonial rifle, while his left moved in a controlled arc. Within seconds, Klein found himself facing the palace gates instead of the guard, his arm held securely but not painfully behind him. "I can't believe what I'm seeing," whispered an American tourist to his wife, his breakfast sandwich forgotten in his hand. The crowd had grown completely silent, save for the rapid clicking of camera shutters and the soft whirring of phone cameras recording every moment. A retired police officer in the crowd nodded approvingly at James's technique. The move had been textbook perfect, minimum force, maximum control. Klein's face showed pure shock, his alcohol-addled brain struggling to process how quickly the tables had turned. All his previous bravado vanished in an instant. The young artist who had been sketching the palace earlier fumbled for her phone, knowing this would be a moment worth capturing. Her charcoal-stained fingers left smudges on her screen as she pressed record, but she didn't care. History was unfolding before her eyes. 2 police officers reached the scene just as James completed his defensive move. They found Klein already perfectly positioned for them to take control of the situation. A senior officer would later comment that it was one of the smoothest joint operations he'd ever seen, even though it hadn't been planned. "That's what I call precision," exclaimed a retired army sergeant in the crowd, explained to those around him how perfectly executed the move had been. "Notice how he didn't use any excessive force? That's years of training right there." Others nearby nodded in agreement, impressed by the professional display. The coffee cart vendor, who had seen the entire scene unfold, finally remembered to breathe. He'd served in the military himself years ago, and he recognized the level of skill and restraint it took to handle such a situation so smoothly. He found himself feeling oddly proud, even though he didn't know James personally. A group of schoolchildren who had been on a field trip stood wide-eyed, their teacher using the moment as an impromptu lesson about consequences and respect. "See how calm and professional the guard remained?" She pointed out quietly to her students. "That's what real strength looks like." The whole incident had lasted less than 10 seconds, but its impact would be felt for much longer. Phones continued recording as the police took charge of Klein, who had suddenly become very quiet and compliant. The contrast between his earlier behavior and current demeanor was striking. A young couple who had just gotten engaged at the palace gates stood hand in hand, their romantic moment temporarily forgotten in the wake of what they'd witnessed. "That was amazing," the bride-to-be whispered, squeezing her fiance's hand. "I've never seen anything like it." James smoothly returned to his post, resuming his guard position as if nothing had happened. But the crowd knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary, a perfect blend of training, professionalism, and controlled response. The morning sun continued to shine on his spotless uniform, but now everyone present understood that beneath the ceremonial exterior stood a highly trained soldier, ready to respond to any situation with skill and dignity. As the police led Klein away, the plaza buzzed with excitement. Tourists who had witnessed the incident were already sharing their videos, their fingers flying across phone screens as they typed messages to friends and family. "You won't believe what I just saw at Buckingham Palace," became the most typed phrase of the morning. The young artist who had captured everything in her sketchbook was now surrounded by curious onlookers, all eager to see her quick drawings of the incident. Her charcoal sketches captured the fluid motion of James's response in a way that even videos couldn't quite convey. "I've never drawn anything so exciting," she told the growing crowd around her. 2 police officers took statements from nearby witnesses, their notepads filling with accounts from people eager to help. A university professor from Oxford, who had brought his students for a history lesson, found himself explaining to the officers how the guards' response had been perfectly in line with historical military protocols. "I got it all," exclaimed a professional photographer, reviewing the burst shots on his camera's display. Each frame captured a split second of the action, from Klein's aggressive move to James's perfectly executed response. Other tourists gathered around him, asking if he could send them the photos. The coffee cart vendor, who had seen everything from his prime location, was now doing the best business of his career. People gathered around his cart, buying drinks while sharing their versions of what they'd just witnessed. "I've been serving coffee here for 7 years," he told his customers, "but I've never seen anything like that." A group of American tourists, who had arrived just after the incident, listened intently as others recounted what had happened. "We missed it by 2 minutes," one of them said, disappointed. But plenty of people were happy to show them their videos, each adding their own perspective to the story. The street performer in his Charlie Chaplin costume had forgotten to stay in character, too impressed by what he'd seen. "That guy moved like a superhero," he told a group of children, his fake mustache slightly askew from his excited gesturing. "But notice how he didn't hurt anyone. That's what real heroes do." James maintained his position as steady as ever, while tourists now viewed him with newfound respect. Gone were the silly attempts to make him laugh or break his concentration. Instead, people stood at a respectful distance, taking photos with an appreciation for the trained professional behind the ceremonial uniform. The retired army sergeant who had commented on James's technique earlier was now giving an impromptu lesson to interested tourists about the Queen's Guard's training. "They're not just for show," he explained, his chest puffing with pride for his fellow servicemen. "Every one of them is a highly trained soldier." Social media was already lighting up with the first uploaded videos. The hashtag #QueensGuardProfessional started trending as people shared clips of the incident. Comments poured in from around the world, praising James's calm and measured response to such a challenging situation. A mother knelt down to explain to her young son why everyone was so excited. "That guard showed us something very important today," she said softly. "He showed us how to stay calm and professional, even when someone is being very unkind." The boy nodded, his eyes fixed on James with newfound admiration. The Palace Visitor Center staff found themselves fielding countless questions about the Queen's Guard training program. A senior staff member smiled as she explained to curious tourists that while the guards might look decorative in their ceremonial uniforms, they were all fully qualified soldiers with years of training and experience. The morning's events had transformed a typical tourist attraction into a powerful lesson about dignity, professionalism, and proper response to provocation. As the excitement began to settle, the regular rhythm of palace life resumed, but everyone present knew they had witnessed something they would remember for years to come. By evening, the morning's incident had spread across the globe. News channels played the footage on repeat, while social media exploded with millions of views and shares. The most viral clip, shot by a tourist from Japan, had already reached 50 million views and was still climbing. "Look at this comment from Australia," exclaimed a teenager to her family at dinner, reading from her phone. Someone wrote, "This is how you handle hate, with dignity and professionalism." It's got over 100,000 likes already. Her parents nodded in agreement, proud that their daughter was learning such an important lesson. In a cozy London pub near Tower Bridge, where James often met his brother, the regulars gathered around the TV above the bar. The evening news was showing various angles of the incident, complete with expert analysis. "That's my regular customer, that is," the proud bartender told everyone within earshot. "Always polite, always professional, just like you saw today." A group of military veterans meeting for their weekly coffee catch-up found themselves discussing the incident with great interest. "Perfect technique," said one, using salt and pepper shakers to demonstrate the move to his friends. "Exactly what we were taught in training. Minimum force, maximum control." Online forums filled with discussions about the Queen's Guards training. A retired guard posted a detailed explanation of their preparation, surprising many who had thought the guards were just ceremonial figures. "Every guard stands ready to protect the palace and its visitors," he wrote. "Today just happened to be the day everyone got to see it." The young artist's sketches from the scene had gone viral too. A local gallery owner spotted them online and reached out immediately, offering to display them in an upcoming exhibition about London's living history. "These capture something the videos missed," the gallery owner explained. "They show the human side of the story." Parents used the incident as a teaching moment. A primary school teacher in Manchester built her Monday morning discussion around it, asking her students what they thought about handling difficult situations. "The guard was like a superhero," one small boy said, "but his superpower was staying calm." The coffee cart vendor who witnessed everything had his busiest day ever. Television crews kept stopping by for interviews, wanting to hear his eyewitness account. "I've seen all sorts here," he told them, making his signature cappuccino without missing a beat. "But this will be the story I tell my grandchildren." Military organizations worldwide shared the video as an example of perfect protocol. "Notice the restraint," commented a military training instructor in a viral post. "The guard had every right to respond more forcefully, but he chose the most professional option. That's what excellence looks like." Local tour guides quickly updated their speeches to include the incident. "Standing right where you are now," they told wide-eyed tourists, "is where a Queen's Guard showed the world what true professionalism looks like." Visitors would nod, many taking photos of the exact spot where it happened. A famous actor who had witnessed everything posted about it to his millions of followers. "Today, I saw a real character in action. No script could have written it better. This guard showed us all how to face hatred with dignity." His post generated thousands of supportive comments from around the world. The incident sparked important discussions about respect, both for the guards and between people in general. News shows hosted debates about appropriate behavior at tourist sites, while cultural experts explained the significance of the Queen's Guard and their dual role as both ceremonial figures and active military personnel. By nightfall, as James finished his shift and headed home, he had no idea he'd become an international symbol of professional restraint and dignity. His simple act of doing his job properly had resonated with millions, turning an ugly incident into a powerful lesson about handling confrontation with grace and skill. A week after the incident, the changes at Buckingham Palace were subtle but significant. Tourists still gathered to take photos with the guards, but there was a new sense of respect in the air. Gone were the silly attempts to distract them. Instead, visitors studied their disciplined stance with genuine admiration. Klein faced serious consequences for his actions. The court hearing was brief but impactful. "This behavior has no place in our society," the judge declared, issuing a substantial fine and a ban from approaching royal residences. Klein's written apology, though late in coming, showed genuine remorse for his actions. The young artist's sketches of the incident now hung in a small London gallery, part of an exhibition called Moments That Matter. Visitors would stand quietly before her charcoal drawings, taking in how she'd captured the guard's dignity and professionalism in just a few precise lines. These drawings remind us that behind every uniform is a real person, the gallery owner explained to visitors. The coffee cart vendor had his best month ever. Tourists would seek out his cart, hoping to hear his first-hand account of the incident. The best part, he'd tell them, stirring hot chocolate for wide-eyed children, was how the guard went right back to his duty. No fuss, no drama, just pure professionalism. James received a commendation for his handling of the situation, presented quietly during a regular morning briefing. His commanding officer's words were simple but meaningful. "You've shown the world what we stand for." The other guards nodded in agreement, knowing any one of them might face a similar test of character. A new section appeared in the palace's visitor guidelines, explaining the dual role of the Queen's Guard as both ceremonial figures and active duty soldiers. "These men and women deserve your respect," it read. "They represent centuries of tradition and professional excellence." Tourist companies quickly updated their brochures to include similar messages. The incident became a teaching moment in unexpected places. A professor at a prestigious military academy used the video in his leadership class. "Notice the perfect balance of force and restraint," he told his students. "This is what we mean by professional response to provocation." Local schools invited military veterans to speak about duty and respect. One former guard, speaking to a room full of teenagers, put it simply, "Being professional doesn't mean being a pushover. It means knowing exactly how to handle tough situations with dignity." The palace gift shop noticed an interesting trend. Children started asking for toy guard figures more than crowns or tiaras. "They don't just see them as static figures anymore," a shop worker explained. "Now they understand these guards are real heroes who know how to handle tough situations properly." James's brother noticed a change in how people treated him when they learned his connection to the famous guard. "My brother always said the uniform carries a responsibility," he'd tell curious listeners at his workplace. That day, he showed everyone exactly what he meant. The incident even influenced palace security procedures. New signs appeared, clearer and more prominent, explaining the guard's role and the consequences of interfering with their duty. Tourist guides received additional training on explaining proper behavior around the guards. A month later, a documentary maker interviewed the retired army sergeant who had witnessed everything. What happened that day wasn't just about one guard handling one situation, he reflected. It was about showing the world how to stand firm against hatred without losing your dignity. As the summer turned to autumn, the incident became part of palace lore, a story told and retold by guides and visitors alike. But its real impact went deeper than just a viral moment or a tourist tale. It had shown people worldwide that true strength lies not in aggression, but in maintaining your dignity and professionalism, even in the face of provocation.